All right, Larry, also when it comes to Ukraine, it has intensified its long-range drone attacks deep inside Russian territory. How strategically important are these strikes in your point of view, and are they changing Russia's military calculations? Also, Russia continues to launch these large-scale missile and drone attacks despite sanctions and battlefield challenges. What does this tell us also about Moscow's military resilience? Some reports also say Russia's territorial gains have slowed considerably. Do you feel this is true, or are there other challenges that you feel are in the pipeline as well?
Yeah, no, that's all Western propaganda. Look, the strikes that have taken place inside Russia, they're embarrassing. Strategically, they're meaningless. It means nothing to the conquest. It doesn't improve Ukraine's ability to defend itself. It doesn't mean that Ukraine can now produce more weapons. It doesn't mean that Ukraine can now have more soldiers sign up and enlist. All of that is just the opposite. Ukraine is in a position where it is desperate for manpower, and they don't have any good, clear solution for that. They've lost an estimated 1.7 million soldiers. Russia, by contrast, has suffered probably less than 200,000 dead. So I mean, it's like for every dead Russian, there's 8 to 10 dead Ukrainians. It's that much of a discrepancy, and the problem Ukraine has is they're now a country of about 21 million people. Russia is still 140 million. Russia has defense industries that are intact and protected from attacks from Ukraine. There's not a single manufacturing site in Ukraine that is immune or protected from a potential Russian strike. So that's what we're seeing now. We're just seeing that this whole situation, the war of attrition continues, and as each day passes, the ability of Ukraine to sustain itself in a combat environment weakens.
All right, but in this whole process, why not move towards peace talks? We did remember in the first year, there were so many ventures into that very aspect of moving towards some kind of a peace initiative. And we had a lot of developments there, but then it all fizzled out. Peace talks again appear to have stalled. In your view, what are the biggest obstacles that prevent these meaningful negotiations between Moscow and Kiev?
Western interference and a refusal to listen to what the Russians have said. The Russian position has been very clear since June 14th of 2024. Well, in fact, let's go back to in April of 2022. There was a peace agreement that Russia had agreed to. This peace agreement was brought to the table by Ukraine. I sat in a small meeting with Judge Napolitano and Mario Nafal, with Foreign Minister Lavrov back in March of 2024. And he noted at the time that this peace agreement, or this truce, had been brought to the table by Ukraine, and then it was the Brits, through Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and his defense chief, Lloyd Austin, that pressured Ukraine to walk away from it. And from there, the face of the war changed. So jump ahead to 2024, Vladimir Putin made it very clear. The 4 oblasts that used to be part of Ukraine, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk, those are now permanently part of Russia, and Ukraine and the West need to accept that. That's condition number 1. Condition number 2, that NATO needs to get out into all support and all personnel, intelligence sharing with Ukraine now. And 3, there needs to be a new election. A legitimate government has to be elected in Ukraine. Until then, there's nothing else to negotiate on. So the Russians aren't looking for, they're not going to make any concessions. That's their position. And they've been very firm about that. And the West keeps thinking that they're not serious.
But of course, as you say, Russia is serious. Thank you very much, Larry C. Johnson, to have joined us all the way from Washington, D.C. and to have discussed two important issues with us. And of course, thank you for your eminent point of view. We've now been by Brian Jota Maya from Argentina. Brian, thank you very much to have joined us. It's also our first interaction with you. So let's move ahead right now. We are seeing, Brian, a record number of drones being used by both the sides. Has the Russia-Ukraine war become the defining example of drone warfare for future conflicts? Also, Ukrainians claims their deep strike campaign is disrupting Russian logistics and oil infrastructure. How significant, in your point of view, are these developments from a military perspective?
Assalamu alaikum, Omar. Greetings from Argentina, and thank you for having me on Beyond Borders on Pakistan TV. So, yes, I think the war in Ukraine has changed the way we understand modern war. On one side, we still see all elements of war: trenches, artillery, tanks, and soldiers fighting for a very small pieces of land. But on the other side, drones have become central. Military drones and civilian drones, or first-person view drones and the long-range drones, are now shaping the battlefield every day. So this is important because drones are not only used to attack, they are used to see, to guide artillery, to stop movements, or to hit supply routes. It is very important in the war. So you can to create fear behind the front line with drones. Together with electronic warfare and information operations, they are making the battlefield much wider and much more complex than the other times in the history of the world. So the attacks on oil and critical infrastructure are also very significant in this situation, because both sides are trying to hit what keeps the war running: fuel, logistic, ports, energy, ammunition, and command systems. This affects military operation on the front line, but it also affects the economy, the public morale, and the sense of security inside society.
All right, Brian, Russia still controls around 1/5 of Ukrainian territory. Now, despite slower advances, does Moscow remain still in a strategically strong position in this conflict?
Russia is still in a strong position in some ways. It controls a large part of Ukrainian territory, as you said, but it has the capacity to keep pressure on several fronts, and it can sustain a long war with artillery, drones, missiles, and manpower. So it would be a mistake to underestimate Russia. But I would not describe Russia's position as comfortable. This is not a clean victory for Moscow, because Russian advances are slow, costly, and very difficult to turn into a decisive military result. And at the same time, Russia has to watch other strategic areas, including the Middle East, the Caucasus, and its relation with China and its internal economy. So my view is this: Russia has endurance, yes, but also cost and limits. Moscow may be trying to sustain pressure in Eastern Europe, wait for political change in the West, and turn time into a strategic advantage. But does not mean the war is already decided. I think no, absolutely.
All right, Brian, also this is my last question. European countries continue to increase military and financial assistance to Ukraine. How sustainable is that support over the long term as well? Because you talk about the situation as well. Ukraine is also seeking domestic production capabilities for air defense systems and missiles. How important is that self-sufficiency from a Kiev's point of view, in your take?
European support is okay, but probably not as fast or as strong as Ukraine would like. Some months ago, Ursula von der Leyen was in Buenos Aires, and I asked her about the criticisms that the European Union and the NATO were helping Ukraine too slowly, step by step, instead of giving more decisive support. Her answer was, elegant and realistic, because she said that administrative times and military production time are not always as fast as political wishes. For me, that means support will continue, but the rhythm will depend on production, budget, political decisions, and military stocks. Europe wants Ukraine to resist, but Europe is also learning. That is what not fully prepared for a long industrial war. This is one of the biggest, for me, lessons of Ukraine. Modern war consumes drones, missiles, air defense, ammunition, and equipment at very high speed. That is why Ukrainian self-sufficiency is so important. Kyiv cannot depend forever only on weapons arriving from abroad at the right time. Ukraine needs to produce more drones in a long war. The country that can produce, repair, adapt, and innovate faster has better chance to survive. I think this is the key in the war in Ukraine.
All right. A lot of keys in the war in Ukraine is concerned, but the whole important point is how do you put the keys in the right locks. I think that is extremely important. Thank you very much, Brian Chota-Meyer, to have joined us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope till next time, which will be very soon. Reverting back to the Middle East, the world is watching Lebanon with growing alarm. Despite a ceasefire, Israeli airstrikes and ground operations are expanding deeper into Lebanese territory, forcing families from their homes, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire. From Beirut's southern suburbs to Tyre and Nabati, casualties are mounting, displacement is rising. Israel's so-called yellow line has turned large parts of southern Lebanon into a no-go zone. Today's emergency UN Security Council meeting reflects a simple reality that the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon can no longer be ignored. To discuss that in a bit more of detail, we've been joined by Mariam Ishani. She's a former United Nations Security Council monitor and conflict affairs reporter, joins us from Paris. Thank you very much, Mariam, to have joined us. You've been a former monitor and reporter for the UN Security Council, focusing on the impact of armed conflicts on civilians. Now, Lebanon is a country on the UN Security Council watch list, and they'll be meeting about it in an emergency session today. Does the scale of Israel's offensive suggest that Lebanon is entering a far more dangerous phase of the conflict? Do you believe today's discussions can produce meaningful pressure for de-escalation, or is the gap between diplomacy and events that are happening on the ground simply too wide right now?
To answer the first of all, thank you for having me. But to answer the first part, yes, without question, we're in a far more dangerous phase, and the events of today alone confirm that. Germany's development minister had to abort her Beirut trip this morning mid-approach to the airport because of the acutely escalating situation on the ground. Since 2006, this border region has been governed, however imperfectly, by UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which explicitly stated that the area south of the Litani River is to be free of armed groups, and that framework has effectively collapsed today. Israeli forces themselves shared footage yesterday of the troops in Qalat al-Shakif, also known as Beaufort Castle, near Nabatia. This is the deepest incursion into Lebanon in more than 26 years, and Netanyahu himself called it a dramatic stage and a dramatic shift. And this is why France has requested an emergency session of the UN Security Council today. When I monitored conflicts for the Security Council, the threshold we watched for was exactly a situation like this, because once a precedent of occupation is set and a resolution is disregarded wholesale, then the timeline for resolving things moves from weeks to years. As for the second part of your question, I'll be blunt. The Security Council is unlikely to produce a binding outcome because any resolution with real teeth would almost certainly face a US veto. Now, that doesn't mean that what's happening in New York is all theater. The gap is also widening with each vote between Israel and other powerful UN member states, not just France, but Germany and Japan. It also gives member states that want to remain neutral opportunities to harden their position in one direction or another. And something that I think is underappreciated is that what the Council also does today is build the formal record. It puts the displacement, the casualties, the strikes on medics and journalists into the official account that legal and enforcement mechanisms will later draw on. UN experts have already called for independent external investigation, and each vote is an opportunity for monitors and reporters to apply pressure on member states and build some coalition of action.
All right, some coalition action. So let's see what that brings us to at the end of the United Nations Security Council. Now, despite a ceasefire, Mariam, Israeli attacks continue and even intensify. From a UN perspective, how seriously are these attacks undermining diplomatic efforts of any kind to end this conflict?
I mean, profoundly, because at no point during this ceasefire, before or after the extension, has it been a ceasefire. Lebanon has already filed formal complaints with the Security Council citing more than 2,000 violations by Israel over 3 months. And this matters because when two sides cannot agree on what a ceasefire prohibits, it stops functioning as a de-escalation tool and it becomes a source of escalating grievance. So every future mediation now carries the grievances of what was not honored during the last truce. And diplomacy does not function on just the deal. The process is almost everything. It needs the belief that a deal means something, and that belief is crumbling, not just for this region, but anywhere that a ceasefire is needed. Simultaneously, the U.S. is also trying to hold a negotiating track with security talks in Washington on Friday, a fourth round planned for Tuesday and Wednesday, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio said to both President Aoun and Prime Minister Netanyahu over the weekend, but reinforcing the U.S. position that the U.S. demand is that Hezbollah disarm first, which is likely to just produce a stalemate similar to the one that they already have with Iran.
Now, Mariam, in all of this is the increase in violence or aggression from the Israeli side, especially in southern Lebanon. Now, the European Union, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Qatar, Egypt, and others have all called for restraint. Are we witnessing unusually broad international criticism of Israel's actions in Lebanon? Israel argues these operations are necessary for security, yet many Lebanese see them as a violation of sovereignty. How is this debate playing out inside United Nations circles?
It is unusually broad, and it's also more consequential because of who is now in the chorus. Condemnation is expected from certain quarters, but what is noticeable, as you mentioned, is the shift among Israel's closest partners. So in early May, the German foreign minister was calling Israel's invasion of Lebanon necessary and said that Israel had every right to be there. But now, by the end of the same month, just a week ago, the same minister was raising alarms about the advancement and the displacement crisis. France's Macron has now said that nothing justifies this escalation. The EU has called on Israel to stop the escalation. If you add Qatar and Egypt, who are central to regional mediation, you now have an alignment across the blocs that do not usually get on the same page about Israel. I will say, though, that this harmony of statements does not necessarily mean harmony of action. UN experts have explicitly called on member states to suspend arms transfers to Israel while credible evidence of serious violations exists, and that has not happened. But to answer the second part, this is the fault line. Hezbollah fired thousands of missiles towards Israel on March 2nd in retaliation for the killing of Iran's supreme leader by the U.S. and Israel frames everything that followed as self-defense. And what I would stress is that under international humanitarian law, we don't have to choose between those framings. International humanitarian law asks whether the specific conduct can be squared with the principles of distinction and proportionality, and UN experts have found that strikes on densely populated areas of central Beirut, like you said, Dahiyeh, violate those principles. Threatening Dahiyeh, one of the most densely populated districts of the entire country, the use of white phosphorus, the double and triple tap attacks on medical workers, none of these are in line with UN principles on distinction and proportionality. And for the UN, necessity is not a blank check. And that is the line that international lawyers are consistently stressing.
I think this is a line that the international lawyers should continue to pursue, and even more aggressively with each passing day, because we are seeing more and more people being killed inside of Lebanon. I mean, Palestine is something that we are seeing, but what is happening is Lebanon seems to be a replica of exactly the formula that Israel is using in Palestine. More than 1 million Lebanese, Mariam, have been reportedly been displaced while shelters are already overwhelmed. How severe has a displacement crisis become on the ground?
Well, more than 1 million people are displaced. Shelters are overwhelmed. It is severe by any standard, and like you said, this is not an exceptional condition. This has now become the norm. Lebanon has a population of 5.5 million, so you have to put that 1 million into context of that. And Israel has issued evacuation orders for approximately 15 new towns and villages in the Sidon and Jezin districts that are far from the border. So the combat zone that Israel declared last week already reaches roughly 40 kilometers north of the border and encompasses Tyre and Nabatea, two of southern Lebanon's most populous areas. And now Beirut's southern suburbs under evacuation threat. So this goes beyond displacement. We have to consider that, is this really just displacement? Because the residents of 55 villages inside the buffer zone have already been barred from going home, and demolitions are underway. And Israel Katz's statement this morning was that Israel will establish a military-controlled zone in the Litani area, and this suggests the barrier is not temporary. So for aid agencies, displacement that you expect to reverse is difficult to manage, but displacement that may be permanent is a different order of magnitude entirely.